Sarah Matthews stood at the edge of the small-town bus station, clutching a worn suitcase that contained everything she owned. The autumn wind whipped through her long brown hair as she watched the Greyhound bus disappear down the dusty road, taking with it her last connection to the life she had known. At 18, she had made a decision that would change everything. The arrangement had been made through letters. Thomas Brennan, a rancher in the remote Modoc County of Northern California, had placed an advertisement in the newspaper. He needed someone to help care for his twin children after his wife had passed away 2 years earlier. Sarah, fresh out of the foster care system with nowhere else to go, had responded to his letter with careful handwriting and honest words about her situation. Thomas had written back within a week. His letters were short but kind, explaining that he lived on a cattle ranch 15 miles from the nearest town. He promised room, board, and a small salary in exchange for helping with his 5-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan. What struck Sarah most was his honesty about the isolation and the hard work that ranch life demanded. He had not made false promises about an easy life. The pickup truck that approached the bus station was older but well-maintained, its red paint faded by years of sun and weather. Through the windshield, Sarah could see a man in his early 30s with weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. Thomas Brennan stepped out of the truck and Sarah was surprised by how tall he was. His brown hair was slightly messy from the wind and his blue eyes held a gentleness that immediately put her at ease. "Sarah?" he asked, extending his hand. His voice was deeper than she had imagined from his letters. When she nodded, he smiled for the first time, and she noticed how it changed his entire face. "Welcome to Modoc County. I hope you're ready for a different kind of life out here." The drive to the ranch took nearly an hour through winding mountain roads lined with pine trees and open meadows. Thomas talked quietly about the land, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography of the area. Sarah learned that the ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and that he raised both cattle and horses. He spoke with pride about the land, but there was something else in his voice that she could not quite identify. "The twins are excited to meet you," Thomas said as they turned onto a dirt road marked by a simple wooden sign reading, "Brennan Ranch." "They haven't had much female influence since their mother died. My sister comes to visit sometimes, but she lives 4 hours away in Sacramento." Sarah felt nervous energy building in her stomach as they approached the ranch house. It was a 2-story wooden structure with a wraparound porch and large windows that looked out over rolling hills dotted with cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see warm light glowing from the windows as the sun began to set behind the mountains. 2 small figures burst through the front door before the truck had even come to a complete stop. The twins were identical in height and build, but Sarah could immediately see their different personalities. Emma ran straight to the truck with confidence, her blonde curls bouncing as she moved. Ethan followed more cautiously, staying close to his father's side when Thomas got out of the vehicle. "Are you Sarah?" Emma asked, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "Daddy said you're going to live with us and help us with things." "Do you know how to braid hair? Mine gets all tangled and Daddy doesn't know how to fix it right." Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, feeling some of her nervousness fade away. "I do know how to braid hair. Maybe I can show you tomorrow morning." She turned to Ethan, who was peering at her from behind his father's leg. "And you must be Ethan. Your daddy told me you're really good at building things with blocks." The little boy's face lit up at the mention of his favorite activity. "I built a castle yesterday that was taller than me. Do you want to see it? It's in the living room." As they walked toward the house, Sarah noticed how Thomas watched his children with such love and attention. He listened carefully to everything they said and responded to their questions with patience. When Emma grabbed Sarah's hand to lead her up the porch steps, she caught Thomas smiling at the scene. But there was something else in his expression that she could not read. The inside of the house was warm and comfortable, with wooden floors and furniture that looked sturdy rather than fancy. The living room had a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled softly, and Sarah could see evidence of the twins everywhere. Toy blocks were scattered across the carpet along with coloring books, crayons, and a few stuffed animals. "I'll show you to your room," Thomas said, picking up Sarah's suitcase. "It's upstairs next to the twins' room. I hope you'll be comfortable there." He led her up a wooden staircase to a hallway with 4 doors. "That's Emma and Ethan's room," he said, pointing to the first door. "The bathroom is there, and this will be your room." Sarah's room was simple but clean, with a single bed covered in a handmade quilt a wooden dresser, and a window that looked out over the pasture where horses grazed in the fading light. It was the first room that had ever truly belonged to her, and she felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized this might finally be the home she had been searching for. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour," Thomas said from the doorway. "Nothing fancy, just beef stew and cornbread. The twins eat early and go to bed by 8, so we'll have time to talk about routines and expectations afterward." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm grateful you're here. The twins need stability and care that I haven't been able to provide on my own." As Thomas's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah sat on the edge of her new bed and looked around the room that would be her sanctuary. Outside her window, the last light of day painted the mountains purple and orange, and she could hear the twins' laughter echoing from somewhere in the house. For the first time in years, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to grow in her chest. But as she unpacked her few belongings into the dresser drawers, Sarah could not shake the feeling that there was something important about Thomas Brennan that she had not yet discovered. The way he sometimes paused in the middle of sentences, as if choosing his words very carefully, and the sadness that lingered behind his smile suggested that this family had secrets that went deeper than the loss of a wife and mother. Sarah's first week at the Brennan Ranch fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and foreign to her. She woke each morning before sunrise to the sound of Thomas moving around downstairs, preparing for his daily work with the cattle. By the time she made it to the kitchen, he would have coffee brewing and would be packing a lunch for his long day outdoors. The twins were early risers, bouncing into the kitchen by 7 o'clock with energy that amazed Sarah. Emma would immediately launch into detailed plans for the day, while Ethan would quietly eat his breakfast and listen to his sister's chatter. Sarah found herself settling into the role of caretaker more easily than she had expected, helping with morning routines, preparing meals, and keeping the children entertained during the long autumn days. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk. Coming in for lunch covered in dust and exhaustion, Sarah noticed that he never complained about the physical demands of ranch work, but she could see the weariness in his movements and the lines of stress around his eyes. When she offered to pack his lunches or have dinner ready when he returned, he accepted gratefully but seemed surprised that anyone would think to take care of him. "You don't have to do all this," he said one evening, as she placed a plate of pot roast and vegetables in front of him. "I hired you to help with the twins, not to wait on me." Sarah sat down across from him at the wooden kitchen table, watching as Emma and Ethan argued playfully over who got the last dinner roll. "I don't mind. You work so hard and it's nice to feel useful." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've never really had a family to take care of before." Something shifted in Thomas's expression at her words, a softness that made him look younger despite the lines of fatigue around his eyes. "We're glad you're here, Sarah. The twins have been happier this week than they've been in months." It was true. Emma and Ethan had blossomed under Sarah's attention, responding to her patient guidance and genuine interest in their activities. She helped Emma learn to braid her own hair and taught Ethan new building techniques with his blocks. More importantly, she listened to them with the kind of focus that children craved but rarely received from busy adults. But Sarah also noticed things that concerned her. Sometimes she would catch Thomas staring out the kitchen window with an expression of deep worry, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He received phone calls that he would take in his office with the door closed, and she could hear the tension in his voice even through the walls. Once she had seen him burning papers in the fireplace late at night, feeding document after document into the flames with grim determination. The strangest thing was how he reacted to visitors. The few times that neighbors or delivery drivers came to the ranch, Thomas would become rigid with anxiety, positioning himself between them and the house as if protecting something precious. He was always polite but never invited anyone inside, conducting all business on the front porch or by the barn. One afternoon, while the twins were napping, Sarah was folding laundry in the living room when she heard Thomas on the phone in his office. The door was slightly ajar, and though she tried not to listen, his raised voice made it impossible to ignore. "I've told you before, I'm not interested in selling," he was saying, his tone sharp with frustration. "This land has been in my family for generations, and it's going to stay that way." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower but more intense. "I don't care what kind of pressure you think you can apply. I have children to think about, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah quickly moved away from the office door, but the conversation stayed with her. Who was trying to pressure Thomas to sell his ranch? And why did he sound so frightened when he mentioned his children? That evening, after the twins were in bed, Sarah found Thomas sitting on the front porch with a beer in his hand, staring out at the pasture where his horses moved like shadows in the moonlight. The autumn air was crisp, and she pulled a sweater around her shoulders as she joined him on the porch swing. "Beautiful night," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Thomas turned to look at her, and in the pale light, she could see the weight of whatever burden he was carrying etched into his features. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" When she nodded, he continued. "What made you answer my advertisement? A young woman like you could have found work anywhere, probably someplace with more excitement and opportunity than this isolated ranch." Sarah considered how much to tell him. She had learned early in life that people often judged you based on your past, and she was not sure she was ready to risk the fragile sense of belonging she had found here. But something in Thomas's voice told her that he was asking the question for deeper reasons than simple curiosity. "I aged out of foster care," she said finally. "I had been in the system since I was 12, moved around to different families who were paid to take care of me, but never really wanted me there." She watched his reaction carefully, but his expression remained open and understanding. "When I turned 18, I was on my own. I had a job at a diner and a tiny apartment, but I was just surviving, not really living." Thomas nodded slowly, and she could see recognition in his eyes. "When I read your letter about needing help with your children, something about it felt right. You were honest about the isolation and the hard work, but you also wrote about your children with such love. I thought maybe I could be part of something real here, something that mattered." "You've already become part of something real," Thomas said quietly. "Emma and Ethan talk about you constantly. Yesterday, Emma told me that she wants to grow up to be just like you, and Ethan asked if you were going to stay forever." He paused, taking a long drink from his beer. "I hope you will stay, Sarah. But I need you to know that there might be complications." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the sound of a vehicle approaching on the dirt road made Thomas stiffen with alarm. Headlights cut through the darkness, and Sarah could see a black sedan moving slowly toward the house. Thomas stood up quickly, his entire posture changing to one of defensive readiness. "Go inside," he said in a low voice. "Lock the door and stay away from the windows." "Thomas, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, fear beginning to creep into her voice. The sedan stopped in front of the house, and two men in dark suits got out. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see that they carried themselves with the kind of authority that made ordinary people nervous. Thomas stepped down from the porch to meet them, putting distance between the visitors and the house where his children slept. "Mr. Brennan," one of the men called out, "we need to have another conversation with you." Sarah's heart began to race as she realized that whatever secret Thomas was hiding, it was serious enough to bring official-looking men to his door in the middle of the night. As she quietly moved toward the front door, she could hear Thomas's voice, steady but tense, as he began to speak with the strangers who had invaded the peaceful sanctuary of the ranch. Sarah pressed herself against the living room wall, her heart pounding as she tried to hear the conversation taking place in the front yard. Through the window, she could see Thomas standing with his arms crossed, facing the two men in suits. The porch light cast long shadows across the scene, making it look like something from a crime movie. "We've been more than patient, Mr. Brennan," one of the men was saying. His voice carried clearly in the still night air. "But our client is getting impatient. The offer we discussed last month was generous, and it's not going to remain on the table indefinitely." Thomas's response was firm but quiet, and Sarah had to strain to hear him. "I've already given you my answer. This ranch is not for sale at any price. My children's stability is more important than any amount of money your client wants to offer." The second man stepped forward, and Sarah could see something threatening in his posture. "Mr. Brennan, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This isn't really a negotiation anymore. There are other ways to encourage cooperation, and some of them might be unpleasant for a man with young children to consider." Sarah felt ice run through her veins at the implied threat. She looked toward the staircase, thinking of Emma and Ethan sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that their safety was being discussed in veiled terms in their own front yard. Without fully thinking through her actions, she quietly opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Thomas," she called out softly, "is everything all right?" All three men turned to look at her, and Sarah immediately regretted her decision to interfere. The two strangers examined her with cold, calculating eyes that made her skin crawl. Thomas's face showed a mixture of concern and frustration at her appearance. "Everything's fine, Sarah," Thomas said carefully. "These gentlemen were just leaving." The first man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "And who might this be? The new nanny we've heard about?" He looked Sarah up and down in a way that made her want to retreat back into the house. "Pretty young thing. It would be a shame if anything happened to disrupt this nice domestic arrangement you've got going here." Sarah felt anger flare up alongside her fear. She had spent too many years being intimidated by people who thought they could push her around because of her age and circumstances. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But you're on private property making threats against children. That doesn't seem very professional to me." Thomas moved quickly to position himself between Sarah and the strangers, but she could see approval in his eyes along with concern. The second man laughed, but it was an ugly sound. Feisty. "I like that in a woman." He turned his attention back to Thomas. "You have 48 hours to reconsider our offer, Mr. Brennan. After that, we'll need to explore other options for resolving this situation." The two men walked back to their sedan without another word, leaving Thomas and Sarah standing in the sudden silence of the night. Sarah watched the red taillights disappear down the dirt road before turning to face Thomas, who was running his hands through his hair in obvious distress. "Thomas, what was that about?" she asked. "Who were those men and what do they want with your ranch?" Thomas sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. "It's complicated, Sarah. More complicated than I wanted it to be when I brought you here." Sarah sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort but far enough away to give him space to think. "Maybe you should tell me what's really going on. Those men didn't seem like normal real estate agents." For a long moment, Thomas stared out at the pasture where his cattle moved quietly in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion and worry. "My wife didn't die in an accident like I told people in town. She was murdered." Sarah felt the world shift around her as she processed his words. "Murdered? But why? And what does that have to do with these men wanting to buy your ranch?" Thomas stood up and began pacing the length of the porch, his movements agitated and restless. Rebecca was a journalist. She had been investigating a land development scheme that involved some very powerful people who didn't want their business practices exposed. The ranch sits on land that's worth millions if it's developed properly, and there are people who will do anything to get control of it. "Including murder?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Including murder," Thomas confirmed grimly. Rebecca got too close to the truth about how they were forcing people to sell their land through intimidation and violence. They made her death look like a car accident, but I know better. The brake lines on her car had been cut. Sarah felt sick as she imagined what Thomas had been going through for the past 2 years, raising his children alone while knowing that their mother had been killed and that the same people were now targeting his family. "Have you gone to the police?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "The police investigation concluded it was an accident. Some of the people involved in this development scheme have connections that go pretty high up in law enforcement. I learned quickly that I couldn't trust anyone in an official capacity. So you've just been waiting here hoping they would leave you alone?" "I've been documenting everything I could find about their operation, just like Rebecca was doing. I thought if I could gather enough evidence, I might be able to expose them and get justice for what they did to her." Thomas stopped pacing and looked directly at Sarah. "But I never expected them to escalate to direct threats like this. And I definitely never expected to have someone else to worry about protecting." Sarah understood now why Thomas had seemed so cautious about visitors, why he burned papers late at night, and why he had looked so worried when she mentioned wanting to be part of a real family. "The twins don't know any of this? They think their mother died in a car accident. They're too young to understand the truth, and I want to keep it that way for as long as possible." Thomas sat back down beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating from his body. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. Are you willing to stay here knowing what you know now? These people are dangerous, and being here puts you at risk. I would understand completely if you wanted to leave. I could drive you back to town tomorrow, and I'd give you enough money to get settled somewhere safe. Sarah considered his offer seriously. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that she should take his money and run as far away from this situation as possible. She had finally found a place where she felt wanted and useful, and now she was learning that it came with the very real possibility of violence and danger. But when she thought about Emma's excited chatter at breakfast and Ethan's shy smiles, when she helped him with his building projects, she knew she could not abandon them. And when she looked at Thomas sitting beside her with worry lines etched deeply into his face as he waited for her answer, she realized that her feelings about this family had grown deeper than she had admitted to herself. "I'm staying," she said finally, "but we need to figure out a better plan than just waiting for those men to come back with whatever they're planning to do next." The next morning brought an unseasonably warm October day, but the sunshine did nothing to lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the ranch. Thomas had barely slept, and Sarah could see the exhaustion in his movements as he prepared for another day of pretending everything was normal for the sake of the twins. Emma and Ethan seemed to sense that something had changed, though they were too young to understand what. Emma was more clingy than usual, insisting on holding Sarah's hand as they walked to the chicken coop to collect eggs. Ethan kept asking where his daddy was going and when he would be back, even though Thomas was following his normal routine. "Sarah," Emma said as they scattered feed for the chickens, "are those bad men going to come back?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What bad men, sweetheart?" "The ones who came last night. I heard voices and looked out my window. Daddy looked scared, and that made me scared too." Emma's green eyes were wide with concern that seemed too mature for a 5-year-old. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about business things. Your daddy is very strong and very smart, and he's going to make sure you and Ethan are always safe. But what if they hurt Daddy like they hurt Mommy?" The innocent question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized that the twins understood far more about their mother's death than Thomas realized. Children had a way of picking up on adult conversations and fears, even when the adults thought they were being careful. "Emma, what do you remember about when your mommy died?" Emma picked up a small brown chicken and cuddled it against her chest. "Daddy told us it was an accident, but I heard him crying one night and saying it was his fault for not protecting her. And sometimes when people come to visit, Daddy gets the same scared look he had when the policeman came to tell us about Mommy." Sarah felt a surge of protective anger toward anyone who would threaten this innocent child and her family. She also realized that Thomas had been carrying an enormous burden of guilt along with his grief and fear. "Your daddy loves you and Ethan more than anything in the world. Sometimes adults get sad about things that aren't really their fault." That afternoon, while the twins were occupied with their quiet time, Sarah found Thomas in his office sorting through files and documents. The room was small and cramped, with papers covering every surface and photographs pinned to a corkboard on the wall. Sarah could see that he had been collecting information about the development company for months. "Thomas, we need to talk about Emma," Sarah said, closing the office door behind her. He looked up from a folder of newspaper clippings, his expression immediately concerned. "Is she all right? Did something happen? She knows more than you think she does. About her mother, about why you're scared when strangers come to the ranch. Children see and hear everything, even when we think we're protecting them." Thomas set down the folder and rubbed his face with both hands. "I've tried so hard to keep them from knowing the truth. They've been through enough already." Sarah moved closer to his desk, studying the photographs on the corkboard. She could see pictures of Rebecca with the twins when they were babies, shots of the ranch from different angles, and what looked like surveillance photos of men in business suits. Maybe it's time to think about involving someone official who you can trust. There has to be someone in law enforcement who isn't connected to these people. "I've thought about going to the FBI," Thomas admitted. "But what if I'm wrong? What if I don't have enough evidence and they decide I'm just a paranoid widower, making up conspiracy theories? These people have already proven they're willing to kill to protect their interests." Sarah picked up one of the newspaper clippings from his desk. It was an article about a family in a neighboring county who had lost their ranch in a foreclosure that seemed suspiciously sudden. "How many other families have they done this to?" "At least 6 that I can document. Always the same pattern. They make an offer to buy the land, the family refuses, and then mysterious problems start happening. Equipment gets sabotaged, livestock gets sick, Accidents happen to family members. Eventually, people get scared enough or financially desperate enough to sell. But none of those families had a murdered spouse to motivate them to fight back. Thomas looked at her with surprise. You really think we should fight them? Sarah had been thinking about this all day. Ever since Emma's innocent question about bad men had made her realize how much this family meant to her, she had spent years feeling powerless against people who controlled her circumstances. Moved from home to home without any say in her own life. The idea of standing up to bullies who threatened children appealed to something fierce and protective deep inside her. I think we should be smart about fighting them. You have documentation about their pattern of behavior. You have evidence that your wife was investigating them when she died, and now you have witnesses to them making direct threats against your family. Thomas stood up and walked to the window that looked out over his pasture. Sarah, I need you to understand what you're suggesting. These people have money, connections, and no conscience about hurting innocent people. If we try to expose them and fail, they won't just threaten us next time. And if we don't try to stop them, they'll eventually find a way to force you off this land anyway. At least if we fight back, we have a chance of protecting other families from going through what you've been through. Before Thomas could respond, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Both of them tensed, remembering the visit from the night before. But when Sarah looked out the window, she could see it was just the mail carrier's truck. Thomas went outside to meet the mail carrier, and Sarah could hear them having a normal conversation about the weather and the upcoming hunting season. When he came back inside, he was carrying a large manila envelope along with the regular mail. What's that? Sarah asked. Thomas tore open the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. His face went pale as he looked through them, and Sarah could see his hands beginning to shake. They're surveillance photos, he said quietly. Of you with the twins. Of you and me talking on the porch last night. Sarah took the photographs from him and felt sick as she realized what they meant. Someone had been watching the ranch, taking pictures of their daily activities, documenting their routines and vulnerabilities. The message was clear. They knew everything about the family's movements, and no one was safe. At the bottom of the stack was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Mr. Brennan, we hope you'll reconsider our offer in light of your expanded family responsibilities. Some accidents are easier to arrange than others. Sarah set the photographs down on Thomas's desk and turned to face him. They're not going to stop, are they? Even if you sold them the ranch, they couldn't risk leaving witnesses who know what they've done. Thomas nodded grimly. I think you're right. Which means we really only have one choice if we want to protect Emma and Ethan. We fight back. We fight back, Thomas agreed. But first we need to make sure the twins are somewhere safe, while we figure out how to take these people down. That evening, Thomas made a phone call that would change everything. Sarah sat in the living room with Emma and Ethan, helping them work on a puzzle while listening to his half of the conversation in the kitchen. She could tell he was talking to someone he trusted completely, someone who understood the gravity of their situation. Margaret, I need your help, Thomas was saying. It's gotten worse, and I think it's time to get the children away from here. There was a long pause. Yes, both of them. And Sarah too, if she's willing to go. Margaret turned out to be Thomas's older sister, a teacher who lived in Sacramento with her husband and teenage daughter. When Thomas explained the situation to her over the phone, she immediately agreed to take Emma and Ethan for an extended visit. No questions asked. Pack enough clothes for at least 2 weeks, Thomas told Sarah after he hung up. Margaret and her husband will drive up tomorrow morning to get the twins. They'll be safe there while we figure out our next move. Sarah looked at Emma and Ethan, who were focused intently on finding puzzle pieces that matched the picture of a horse they were building. The thought of leaving them, even temporarily, made her chest tight with anxiety. In just 2 weeks, these children had become the center of her world. What about school? She asked. Won't people notice if they're suddenly gone? I'll call the school in the morning and tell them the twins are taking a family vacation. It's not unusual for ranch families to pull their kids out for a week or two during harvest season. Thomas sat down on the floor next to Ethan, who immediately climbed into his father's lap. The hard part will be explaining to them why they have to go without making them more scared than they already are. That night, after the twins were asleep, Thomas and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Rebecca's files spread between them. Sarah was amazed by the depth of her research. Rebecca had documented connections between the development company and several local officials, traced money transfers that suggested bribery and corruption, and identified a pattern of intimidation that stretched back over 5 years. She was close to something big when they killed her, Thomas said, pointing to a timeline Rebecca had created in the weeks before her death. Look at this. She had scheduled interviews with 3 families who had been forced to sell their land, and she had a meeting planned with someone from the county planning office who claimed to have inside information about zoning irregularities. Sarah studied the timeline, noticing that Rebecca had written several question marks next to certain dates. What did she think was happening with the zoning? The development company was getting land rezoned from agricultural to commercial use almost immediately after they acquired it. That's supposed to be a lengthy process with public hearings and environmental reviews, but somehow they were fast-tracking everything, which means they had someone inside the county office helping them. Thomas nodded. Rebecca thought she had identified who it was, but she died before she could prove it. He pulled out a folder labeled County Planning and showed Sarah a list of names with notes written beside each one. She was focusing on a man named Harold Vaughn, the assistant planning director. Look at this. Sarah read Rebecca's notes about Harold Vaughn, which detailed his sudden lifestyle changes over the past year. He had bought a new car, taken expensive vacations, and moved to a house that seemed far beyond his government salary. Rebecca had also documented several meetings between Vaughn and representatives from the development company. This is good evidence, Sarah said. But we need more than just suspicions about lifestyle changes. Rebecca thought so too. That's why she was planning to approach him directly, to see if she could get him to admit to taking bribes in exchange for expediting the zoning changes. Sarah looked up from the files with a sudden idea forming in her mind. What if we finished what Rebecca started? What if we got Harold Vaughn to confess? Thomas stared at her as if she had suggested they rob a bank. Sarah, these people killed my wife for getting too close to the truth. What makes you think they wouldn't kill us too? Because we're going to be smarter about it than Rebecca was. She was working alone, trying to expose everything by herself. We're going to involve the FBI from the beginning, make sure they know what we're doing and why. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was both risky and potentially brilliant. Sarah would approach Harold Vaughn under the pretense of being a journalist working on a story about rural land development. She would claim to be writing a positive piece about how the county was modernizing its planning processes to accommodate growth. If Vaughn took the bait, she might be able to get him talking about the development company and potentially record him admitting to corruption. It's too dangerous, Thomas said for the 5th time. You don't have experience with this kind of thing, and if something goes wrong, I'll never forgive myself. Thomas, I've been taking care of myself since I was 12 years old. I know how to read people and how to stay safe in situations where I'm not sure who I can trust. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Besides, you'll be there as backup. We'll set up a meeting in a public place and you'll be close enough to help if anything goes wrong. The next morning arrived too quickly. Margaret and her husband David arrived at the ranch in their minivan, and Sarah felt her heart breaking as she watched Emma and Ethan say goodbye to their father. The twins were excited about visiting their aunt and cousin, but Emma kept asking when they would come home. Just a little vacation, Thomas told them, his voice steady despite the emotion Sarah could see in his eyes. Sarah and I have some work to do on the ranch, and then we'll come get you. As the minivan disappeared down the dirt road, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She and Thomas were now alone to face whatever came next, and the ranch felt eerily quiet without the children's laughter echoing through the rooms. Thomas spent the afternoon making phone calls to set their plan in motion. He contacted the FBI field office in Sacramento and spoke with an agent named Jennifer Walsh, who agreed to meet with them the following day to review Rebecca's evidence. He also called the county planning office and arranged for Sarah to interview Harold Vaughn about the county's development initiatives. He sounded eager to talk, Thomas reported after hanging up, almost too eager. He suggested meeting at a restaurant in town tomorrow evening, said he'd be happy to discuss the county's progressive approach to land development. Sarah felt nervous energy building in her stomach as the reality of what they were planning began to sink in. She had never done anything like this before, and the stakes could not be higher. But every time she started to doubt herself, she thought about Emma asking if the bad men were going to hurt her daddy, and her resolve strengthened. That evening, they drove to Sacramento to meet with Agent Walsh. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately inspired confidence. She listened carefully as Thomas explained the circumstances of Rebecca's death and showed her the evidence his wife had collected. "This is impressive investigative work," Agent Walsh said, studying Rebecca's timeline and documentation. "Your wife had good instincts about following the money trail. But you're right that we need more concrete evidence to build a case that will hold up in court." She agreed that their plan to approach Harold Vaughn was worth trying, but she insisted on proper preparation and safety measures. Agent Walsh provided Sarah with a small recording device and coached her on techniques for getting people to reveal information without seeming too obvious about it. "The key is to make him feel important," Agent Walsh explained. "Let him think he's educating you about how smart and efficient the county has become. Men like Vaughn love to brag about their accomplishments, especially to attractive young women." Sarah practiced her cover story until she could recite it naturally. She would be a freelance journalist writing an article about successful rural development models for a regional magazine. She had chosen Modoc County because of its reputation for streamlined planning processes that attracted quality development projects. The next evening, Sarah sat in her car outside Rossetti's restaurant in the center of town, trying to calm her nerves before going inside to meet Harold Vaughn. Thomas was parked across the street where he could see the restaurant entrance, and Agent Walsh was stationed at a table near the back where she could observe without being obvious. Harold Vaughn was exactly what Sarah had expected, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and an expensive suit that seemed designed to make him appear more important than he actually was. He stood up when she approached his table, extending his hand with a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. "Ms. Matthews?" "Harold Vaughn, Assistant Planning Director. I'm so pleased to meet you." His handshake lingered a moment too long, and Sarah had to resist the urge to step back from his overly friendly demeanor. As they ordered dinner, Sarah guided the conversation toward the county's development successes, praising the efficiency she had heard about from other sources. Vaughn responded exactly as Agent Walsh had predicted, puffing up with pride as he described his role in modernizing the planning department. "We've really revolutionized the process," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "What used to take months or even years, we can now accomplish in weeks. It's all about understanding that economic development benefits everyone in the community." "That's remarkable," Sarah said, activating the recording device in her purse. "Can you give me a specific example of how you've streamlined things?" Vaughn smiled broadly, clearly enjoying the opportunity to boast about his achievements. And as he began to describe the shortcuts he had taken to approve certain development projects, Sarah realized that Rebecca's instincts had been absolutely correct. Harold Vaughn's confession exceeded even Agent Walsh's expectations. Over the course of 2 hours, he detailed how he had accepted payments from Westfield Development Corporation in exchange for fast-tracking zoning approvals and overlooking environmental concerns. He named specific amounts, dates, and even showed Sarah photographs on his phone of the vacation home he had purchased with the bribe money. "The beauty of the system," Vaughn said, his voice slightly slurred from the 3 glasses of wine he had consumed, "is that everyone wins. The developers get their projects approved quickly, the county gets increased tax revenue, and people like me get compensated for our efficiency and discretion." Sarah maintained her expression of impressed interest, while internally feeling disgusted by his casual attitude toward corruption. "What about families who don't want to sell their land? Surely some people resist development pressure." Vaughn's smile became less pleasant. "Well, that's where Westfield's persuasion specialists come in. They're very good at helping people understand the benefits of cooperation. Sometimes families need a little encouragement to see reason." "Encouragement? Let's just say that rural life can be dangerous. Equipment failures, accidents, that sort of thing. People usually become more reasonable after they experience a few unfortunate coincidences." Sarah felt her blood run, cold as Vaughn casually described the intimidation tactics that had driven families from their homes. When she asked about the Brennan Ranch specifically, Vaughn's expression darkened. "That's been a particularly stubborn situation. The widow was causing problems before her accident, and now the husband thinks he can play hero. But Westfield has assured me that the Brennan problem will be resolved soon, one way or another." Agent Walsh had heard enough. She stood up from her table and approached theirs, showing her FBI credentials to a suddenly pale Harold Vaughn. "Mr. Vaughn, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and violations of federal racketeering laws." The restaurant erupted in chaos as other diners realized they were witnessing an arrest. Vaughn tried to claim he had been joking, that his statements were hypothetical. but the recording device had captured everything clearly. As Agent Walsh read him his rights, Sarah saw Thomas entering the restaurant, his face tight with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, scanning her face for signs of distress. "I'm fine," Sarah assured him, though her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. "He told us everything. About the bribes, the intimidation, even about Rebecca." Agent Walsh approached them after Vaughn had been taken away in handcuffs. "Excellent work, both of you. This recording gives us enough evidence to arrest several members of the Westfield organization and to reopen the investigation into your wife's death, Mr. Brennan." But their victory celebration was short-lived. As they walked toward the parking lot, Agent Walsh's phone rang. Sarah could see her expression change as she listened to whoever was calling. "We have a problem," Agent Walsh said after hanging up. "Someone tipped off Westfield about Vaughn's arrest. They're moving fast to eliminate evidence and potential witnesses." Thomas grabbed Sarah's arm. "What does that mean?" "It means they know you've been working with us, and they're not going to wait for the legal system to resolve this situation. My colleagues are already en route to your ranch, but I'm concerned they might try to intercept you before you can get to safety." As if summoned by her words, a black sedan pulled into the restaurant parking lot. Sarah recognized it as the same vehicle that had brought the threatening visitors to the ranch 3 nights earlier. 2 men got out, and even in the dim light she could see they were carrying weapons. "FBI!" Agent Walsh shouted, drawing her service weapon. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." Instead of complying, the men began shooting. Agent Walsh pushed Sarah and Thomas behind a parked car as bullets shattered the restaurant's front windows. Other customers screamed and ducked for cover as the peaceful evening dissolved into violence. "Stay down," Agent Walsh ordered, speaking rapidly into her radio to call for backup. "We need to get you 2 out of here alive." Thomas pulled Sarah closer to him as more shots rang out. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I never should have let you get involved in this." "Stop apologizing," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with how calm her voice sounded despite the terror racing through her veins. "We did the right thing. Now we just have to stay alive long enough to see these people brought to justice." Agent Walsh fired several shots over the hood of their protective vehicle, forcing the attackers to take cover behind their sedan. "When I give you the signal, run for the restaurant," she instructed. "There's a back exit that leads to the alley. My backup should be here within minutes." The gunfire intensified, and Sarah could hear sirens approaching in the distance. The Westfield men seemed to realize their window of opportunity was closing. One of them shouted something to his partner, and they began advancing toward the parked car where Sarah, Thomas, and Agent Walsh were hiding. "Now!" Agent Walsh yelled. Sarah and Thomas ran in a crouch toward the restaurant's front entrance, glass crunching under their feet from the shattered windows. Behind them, Agent Walsh continued exchanging gunfire with their attackers, buying them precious seconds to reach safety. They burst through the restaurant's front door to find chaos inside. Tables had been overturned, and terrified customers were huddled against the back wall. The restaurant manager pointed them toward the kitchen, which led to the rear exit Agent Walsh had mentioned. As they ran through the kitchen, Sarah could hear police sirens getting closer and more gunshots from the parking lot. They reached the back door and found themselves in a narrow alley behind the building. Thomas looked around frantically, trying to orient himself in the darkness. "My truck is on the street," he said. "If we can get to it without being seen, we can get back to the ranch and meet up with the FBI agents who are supposed to be there." They made their way carefully through the alley, staying in the shadows cast by dumpsters and utility poles. When they reached the street, they could see police cars surrounding the restaurant and an ambulance pulling up to the front entrance. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but Sarah knew this was far from over. As Thomas started his truck, his phone began ringing. The caller ID showed his sister's number, and Sarah felt a spike of fear as he answered. "Margaret, is everything all right?" Thomas's face went white as he listened to his sister's frantic voice. "What do you mean men came to your house? Are the twins safe?" Sarah's heart stopped as she realized that Westfield had not just targeted them. Somehow they had discovered where Emma and Ethan were staying, and now even the children's safe haven had been compromised. Margaret's voice was shaking as she explained what had happened. 3 men in suits had come to her house an hour earlier, claiming to be social services investigators looking into reports of child endangerment. When Margaret had asked for identification and refused to let them inside, they had become aggressive and demanding. "David called the police," Margaret said. but by the time they arrived, the men were gone. The officer who took our statement said their badges looked fake, and there's no record of any social services investigation involving the twins. Thomas was driving toward Sacramento as fast as he dared, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Are Emma and Ethan all right? Did they see what happened? They're fine, but they're scared. Emma keeps asking if the bad men found them, and Ethan won't let go of my hand. Margaret paused, and Sarah could hear muffled voices in the background. Thomas, there's an FBI agent here now. She wants to talk to you. Agent Walsh's colleague, Agent Rodriguez, had been coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure the twins' safety. She confirmed that the men who had approached Margaret's house were likely Westfield. Operatives trying to locate and, potentially, kidnap the children as leverage against Thomas and Sarah. We're moving your family to a secure location, Agent Rodriguez explained over the phone. The children will be safe, but we need you and Ms. Matthews to come in as well. Westfield is desperate now, and they're going to keep trying to eliminate anyone who can testify against them. The secure location turned out to be a safe house run by the FBI in a quiet Sacramento suburb. When Thomas and Sarah arrived, they found Emma and Ethan in a living room with Margaret, David, and their teenage cousin Jenny. The twins ran to Thomas immediately, and Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched him kneel down to embrace them both. Daddy, Emma cried, throwing her arms around his neck. The bad men came to Aunt Margaret's house, but she didn't let them in. You're safe now, Thomas murmured, holding his children tightly. Sarah and I made sure the bad men can't hurt anyone anymore. Ethan looked up at Sarah with his serious green eyes. Are you going to stay with us forever now? The innocent question hit Sarah with unexpected force. Over the past week, she had been so focused on protecting this family that she had not allowed herself to think about what would happen after the crisis was over. Would Thomas still need her help with the children? Would she want to return to the isolated ranch life? Or would the events of the past few days make staying there impossible? I'll stay as long as your daddy wants me to, she said carefully, not wanting to make promises she might not be able to keep. Thomas looked up at her from where he knelt with the twins, and something in his expression made her heart race. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said days ago. Before he could continue, Agent Walsh arrived at the safe house with news that would change everything. Harold Vaughn had agreed to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Armed with his testimony and the evidence Rebecca had collected, federal agents had conducted simultaneous raids on Westfield Development Corporation offices in 3 states. We've arrested 12 people so far, Agent Walsh reported, including the 2 men who shot at us tonight and the ones who killed your wife. Mr. Brennan, the organization is finished. The relief that washed over Thomas's face was profound. For the first time since Sarah had met him, he looked like a man who was not carrying the weight of constant fear and vigilance. Emma and Ethan seemed to sense the change in their father's mood, becoming more animated and playful than they had been all week. Over the next several hours, Thomas gave detailed statements to federal investigators about everything he had witnessed and documented since Rebecca's death. Sarah provided her own account of the threats and intimidation the family had experienced. By dawn, they had been cleared to return to the ranch under FBI protection while the investigation continued. The drive back to Modoc County felt different from any journey Sarah had taken before. The landscape that had seemed forbidding and isolated when she first arrived now looked like home. The mountains and pine forests represented safety and peace rather than places where danger might be hiding. When they pulled up to the ranch house, Sarah was surprised to see that someone had been maintaining the property while they were away. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the pasture and smoke was rising from the chimney. Thomas's neighbor, an older rancher named Bill Henderson, emerged from the barn as they got out of the truck. Figured you might need some help with the animals, Bill said simply. FBI folks told me it was safe to come over and check on things. Sarah realized that Thomas had more support in the community than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. The isolation he had felt had been partly self-imposed, a result of his fear and his determination to protect his family by avoiding close relationships with neighbors. That evening, after the twins were settled in their own beds for the first time in over a week, Thomas and Sarah sat on the front porch, where they had shared so many conversations over the past month. The autumn air was crisp and stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky. Sarah, Thomas said, turning to face her on the porch swing, What I started to say at the safe house was that I've fallen in love with you. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She had been hoping for those words, but had not dared to expect them given everything they had been through. I know it's complicated, Thomas continued. You came here to help with the children, and I've put you through danger and trauma that you never signed up for. But watching you with Emma and Ethan, seeing how brave you were when we needed to fight back against Westfield, I realized that you've become essential to our family in ways that go far beyond the job I originally offered you. Sarah reached for his hand, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work and the tremor of nervousness as he waited for her response. Thomas, I love you too. And I love Emma and Ethan like they were my own children. But I need you to know that I'm choosing this life, choosing this family, not because I don't have other options, but because this is where I want to be. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had first arrived at the ranch, but everything had changed. She was wearing a simple white dress, and Emma was beside her in a matching flower girl outfit, carefully holding a bouquet of wildflowers they had picked together that morning. Ethan stood with Thomas near the porch, both of them wearing their best shirts and looking proud and happy. The wedding ceremony was small, attended by Margaret's family, Bill Henderson and several other neighbors, and Agent Walsh, who had become a friend during the months of legal proceedings that followed Westfield's collapse. The FBI agent who had helped them bring down a criminal organization was now watching them begin a new chapter of their lives together. As Thomas and Sarah exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to protect and cherish each other and the children who had brought them together, Sarah thought about the journey that had led her to this moment. She had answered an advertisement from a lonely rancher looking for help with his children, but she had found something much more valuable, a family that would love and accept her exactly as she was, and a man whose strength and integrity matched her own determination to build something real and lasting. The secret that had left everyone speechless was not something dark or shameful, as the dangerous circumstances might have suggested. It was the simple truth that love could grow in the most unexpected places, between people who had been tested by loss and fear, but had chosen to trust each other with their hearts and their future. The young woman who had arrived unspoiled by cynicism had helped heal a family broken by tragedy, and in return had found the home she had been searching for all her life.